This is Democracy Here. My name is Maryelen Calderwood, and today we'll be viewing a video statement submitted by Gar Alperovitz regarding the work that he's done on the atomic bomb and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we'll be discussing the video with acclaimed peace and social justice activist, Randy Kehler.
Of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on?
My mother is a feminist and she taught me to see until we all have justice, not one of...
Hello, Randy. Thank you for talking to us at Democracy Here. I just want to start with who Gar Alperovitz is and why we should know him, why he's important to us, and how we came about having this statement to talk about today.
Great. Good to be here, Maryelen. Thanks. Gar is he's an amazing guy. I was fortunate enough to get to know him because he and I were part of a project in the 80s called the Exploratory Project on the Conditions of Peace, or EXPRO for short. And it was a lot of actually pretty hardcore think tankers on the peace side of the equation and a few of us activists. And he's somebody I had then and still have great respect for. He's one of these unusual people who is a marvelous historian, researcher, writer, and also activist. Not to mention which he has been legislative director for members of both the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. He's been published widely and all over the country in major periodicals and newspapers. And when I say progressive, let me just mention that he is, in addition to his work on the atomic bomb, he is the, I think it's the co-founder of something called, what is it here, the Democracy Collaborative, which is a research group that is working on ecologically sustainable economic alternatives and the redistribution of wealth. So this guy really is saying what needs to be said on many fronts. Mm-hmm. So, we'll hear what he has to say on the video, which was requested by a member of the Franklin County CPR, Becky Tippins, who knows Gar, as I do. And what he talks about is his first book, which I think came out in the late 60s, about what is called Atomic Diplomacy, Why We Dropped the Bomb, the history of it, for which he did voluminous research. He also did an update on the book, which I think was in the 90s, and I may have these dates wrong, on the same topic, but by that time there was a lot more additional research, or additional information that had been revealed about exactly what went on in terms of the decision-making on the U.S. side to drop the bomb. One of the things that was just amazing for me to realize in reading the summary of his book and some other things about that is that, and again, tremendous credit to Gar, he found out that in fact we didn't have to drop the bomb. That the whole reason for having a bomb, a nuclear bomb, developing a nuclear atomic bomb, was that we were sure Germany was doing the same thing. And in fact, early on, they were trying to do the same thing. But it was clear before the end of the war, before we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that their efforts had failed. And yet, we had this huge industrial complex devoted to creating our own bomb, one of the most expensive military adventure in U.S. history in terms of construction of anything. And the feeling was, well, we've spent all this money and time and research into this. We're not going to use it? And we need to find out what it does. So the experiment was to drop it on, first the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and then 3 days later on Nagasaki in 1945 on August 9th. And that was an even more powerful uranium bomb. So, and the truth is, as he'll say in what we're going to hear, we knew that the Japanese were ready to surrender before the bombs were dropped. They had a couple of conditions that could easily have been met and thus spared hundreds of thousands of lives. But it's also worth remembering, as has been written about in Gar's book, and I think it may also be in Daniel Ellsberg's book about the history of the bomb, that by the time we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we and our World War II allies had already crossed a critical moral threshold through the firebombing, what was known by Churchill actually as the terror bombing of Dresden, Germany, which took over 100,000 lives almost instantly in a horrible way. And then the firebombing, which we, the US, the Americans did on Tokyo, which took also at least 100,000 lives in what we called firebombing. So once willing to do that, there was very little resistance from a moral perspective, apparently, to not dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the fact that the US people still believe to this day the propaganda that was issued then and continues to be issued, that it was the dropping of those bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that allowed the war to come to an end and avoided a ground invasion which would have cost tens of thousands of US troops. Not true.
Right.
That's the excuse. That's the myth behind all this. So anyway, let's see.
Yeah, so why don't we take a look at the video, and then when we finish that, we'll talk about what Gar had to say.
Great.
Okay? Sounds good.
Good plan.
Hiroshima and Potsdam was published in 1965, well over half century ago. It was published also in the beginning period of the Vietnam War. And much to my surprise, because it had been a doctoral dissertation at Cambridge University, it became a very, very provocative book in the national debate, partly because of the thesis of the book, and partly because of the growing Vietnam War in opposition to the way American foreign policy was developing. The book really was looking primarily at two things. First, I was quite surprised to find that, and this is important, virtually every American military leader of any rank involved, that is top admirals, top generals, including General and later President Eisenhower, are on record publicly saying that the bombing of Hiroshima was totally unnecessary, and in many instances criticizing it as immoral and perhaps illegal. So that's including very close friends of President Truman. The top military leadership did not believe it was necessary and are publicly on record. So the primary thesis of the book, that the bombing was unnecessary and was done for other than military reasons, I think is supported by the military opinion of the day and thereafter. And indeed, if you go to the U.S. Naval Museum today, you will find that in its particular discussion of Hiroshima and the bombing, that in that official museum, there's a plaque that says the bombing was done for political reasons, not military reasons. The Navy in particular was somewhat outraged by the bombing. Second thing to note is that Hiroshima, remember, most of the young Japanese men were out at war. Hiroshima was a city primarily of elderly people and children and women. So the bombing was bombing of civilians, not a particularly important military target, which is why it was left so-called, quote, unblemished until August of 1945. So that's a second reason, and indeed there are people who, international lawyers, who are convinced without doubt in their judgment, I'm not a lawyer, that this was a violation of international law because there was no military need to bomb that particular city. So, and the same is true of Nagasaki, I'm told, for legal reasons. The reason the bombing was so controversial is the following. Military intelligence had decided as early as April 1945, the bombing was in August, but in April they advised the president that the war would end once the Russians came in, and we were begging them to come in because we knew that they were so important to shock the Japanese. Once the Russians came in, and once the emperor of Japan was given some sort of assurance that he could be a figurehead with no power. The Japanese people regarded him as a god figure. And that was already decided that that was going to be done. And indeed, Japan still has the emperor who we kept in place after World War II. But the decision, April 1945, the bombing was in August, American people were advised, American military leaders were advised that the war would end when the Russians came in, and if we only told them they could keep their leader in a powerless position, which we'd already decided to do. So that itself raises some very important questions. And another piece of this puzzle is the meeting in which the decisions about what to do finally were made. It was called the Potsdam Conference. It's one of the outlying suburbs of Berlin, where the United States met with the Soviet Union and Britain to look at the post-war period. Was in July 1945, just before August. We had been begging the Russians to come in, so the dates are important here. They were scheduled to come in the first week of August. Military intelligence advised the war would end if we told Japan they could keep their emperor. We had already decided to keep their emperor. The so-called invasion we were trying to prevent, the full invasion of Japan, was not scheduled until the spring of 1946, at least 6 months, maybe 7 months away. The first possible small landing could not occur until November of 1945. 3 full months. There wasn't much fighting going on as we regrouped for the landing and for the November possible invasion. So we're now here at the first week of August, and the planning just up to it at Potsdam in July. All the plans had included assurances for the Japanese emperor, because U.S. intelligence and British intelligence were clear that the war would end if you told them they could keep him in an honorific position, which had already been decided was going to happen, and he's still there. Keep him there, and also, when the Russians came in, the Japanese were desperately fearing the Russian attack because they would eat up the Japanese armies in Manchuria, that the war would end. So the question then becomes, why was the bomb used, used against primarily civilians, even though clear options were advised by the military and by military intelligence? Indeed, when it was clear that the bombs were going to be used, the United States chiefs of staff, Navy, Army, Air Force, got the British chiefs of staff, urged them to tell Churchill, Prime Minister Churchill, to tell the president to go forward with the old plan, namely, tell them they can keep their emperor because that will facilitate a decision in favor of ending the war. At some point in July, we find that the plan and the explicit written provisions telling the Japanese they could keep their emperor was taken out of the proclamation that was sent to Japan and made public. That made sure Japan would continue fighting. Everybody knew that. So the removal of assurances for the emperor, something everyone had wanted in, was taken out, probably at the request of the Secretary of State, who, it is very clear, wanted to use the atomic bomb. And he is on record as saying that he wanted to use the atomic bomb not because of the Japanese war, which could be ended without it, easily and without an invasion, but instead as a way to show the Russians in negotiations that the bomb was very important and that it would make them more, quote, manageable, he said to several scientists who met with him in the spring of 1945. Now, a lot of what happened in that period is not on record. The President and the Secretary of State, James Burns was his name, were old friends from the Senate, and they spoke together. There's very little written paper, but we do know that the assurances for the emperor were taken out, which meant that the Japanese would keep fighting, and the bomb was used as fast as could be done before the Russians came in. And the timing here is really interesting. Hiroshima was bombed on August 6th. The Russians were scheduled to come into the war in the first week of August, and it was believed the war would end when they came in, if the assurances were kept. And obviously assurances were kept because shortly after the bombing we gave them the assurances, and the emperor is still there. But instead the bomb was used. The argument of my book, Atomic Diplomacy, in 1965, and it was a doctoral dissertation at Cambridge, as I mentioned, was that the evidence strongly suggests, but does not definitively prove because we don't have the documents. Maybe there aren't any documents. Some of them were clearly rewritten by the Secretary of State, a very strange man who literally rewrote documents so that the historical record would be changed. Well documented that he did this. What appears clear is that even though the war was going to end, according to U.S. intelligence, when the Russians came in, instead there was a preference for using the atomic bomb unnecessarily, and that preference probably had to do with, as the president said, giving me a hammer on those boys, on the Russians, or making the Russians more manageable, as the Secretary of State said. That's what it looks like. Now, it would be nice to have the full historical record. It would be nice to have documents that no one has been able to find. We do have some rewritten diaries by the Secretary of State. But if you put together all of the evidence, that's what the book argued, that what we now know, it is strongly suggested the atomic bomb was used for those reasons and not for other reasons. The book was a huge, huge controversy in 1965. I had actually been working in the United States Senate, and then I was working as policy planning for United Nations matters in the State Department as well. But there was a controversy in virtually every major magazine and newspaper, and most of it critical and negative, saying how outrageous you could say this. As I say, President Eisenhower later came out and said exactly the same thing publicly. The bombing was totally unnecessary and was known at the time. And there is evidence that he certainly said this also at the time and beforehand to Secretary of War Stimson, and probably, though we can't prove this, probably to President Truman, though that's a bit unproven. It's hard to nail down some of the things that happened in private without documents. So many people believe that Eisenhower actually directly said this to the president at the time. It's totally unnecessary. It shouldn't be used. So in 1965, there was a huge explosion, partly because of the Vietnam War and partly because of the argument that the United States, or the President of the United States, had used the weapon against primarily women and children. 300,000 people died ultimately in Hiroshima and Nagasaki for no reason connected with military necessity. Well, go forward another 50 years, and I decided to revisit the subject and did a big book called The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb, primarily focused on the decision. My first book had been focused on how the bomb had strengthened U.S. foreign policy, but it did talk about the decision in passing. This book focused entirely both on the decision and then in a second part 2 of the big book, how it is that we came to believe something that none of the military believed. How did the public come to believe that? So the decision to use the atomic bomb goes through the various techniques that were used to convince the American public that the atomic bombing was necessary. Now, in one sense, it was rather easy, although criticisms began after World War II because some of the virtually all the top military leaders spoke out against it. Many of the scientists did as well. It was kind of easy, though, because the bomb occurred, the war ended, and the troops came home. So in the mind of the public, those things were intimately linked, and the president kept saying that's why it was used. But during 1946, there was a growing debate, which ultimately had to be put down, and Secretary of War Stimson, who was a Republican, very conservative, and who himself had not been particularly happy about using the bomb secretly, privately, and had been looking for ways around it in 1945, he was kind of wheeled out on the national stage to write an article written for him by a man named McGeorge Bundy, who later became the National Security Advisor to Kennedy and Johnson. But the article said, well, it was absolutely necessary. It saved 1 million lives, et cetera, the usual argument. So too did Mr. Burns make those arguments. So too did General Groves, the general who had been in charge of building the bomb. There was a powerful propaganda effort, which is the second half of my book, The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb, trying to convince the public, because criticism was growing, that the bomb was absolutely necessary. And it was successful. The propaganda effort was highly successful until about 1965, 67, 70. My book came out in 65. And the reason things changed is some of the documents came out, and particularly the diaries of Secretary of War Stimson, which showed that the bombing was not necessary and demonstrated this whole strategy of delaying everything for the Russians in order to have the bomb ready. It was tested in July. It had to be ready. It was used in August. And so there was a whole strategy of delay to meet with the Russians only after you knew whether the bomb worked or not, et cetera, et cetera. And some of those major documents came out in the mid-60s, early 60s, and they were the basis of the critique. So I think now the American Historical Review, or one or two major historical reviews, have revisited this terrain. And so the decision to use the atomic bomb in many parts of the world, leave aside the United States, the argument I've just made is not terribly controversial among many scholars around the world. Among American scholars, there's still controversy. It is controversial among some scholars around the world, but far less here. It is still being contested by strongly supportive people who support the president, who argue that it was entirely military necessity that to use the bomb. But I think that argument is slowly diminishing, even in the United States, as people reconsider what happened and reconsider the oddity, and it is a strange oddity, that virtually the entire very top leadership of the people who involved the military at that time are on record publicly saying pretty much what my books say, that the bomb was totally unnecessary and was known to be unnecessary at the time. And in many cases, the military themselves, and I take my hat off to them, were outraged at the unnecessary loss of essentially civilian lives in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were cities which had some small military concern, particularly Nagasaki, but basically were the people left behind, the women, children, and the elderly, while the young men went to war. Those are the ones who were bombed and destroyed in those two big world bombings. Time to rethink all of this as we think about the dangers of our own time and the dangers of nuclear war and the dangers of decision-making by people who are less than principled about the possible use of weapons of mass destruction. Very important time to go back and look at the first, and so far only use against civilians of nuclear weapons.
Randy, so let me just say what struck me about this statement by Gar was how the government actually was successful in convincing the American people that the bombing was necessary, the bombing on Hiroshima was necessary, and Nagasaki, simply because of what followed the bombing was the troops coming home. So it must have been successful because the war ended, as he said, and the troops came home. And that's what we have been left with, even someone from a different generation. That was my parents' generation. I was born in 1963, so that's what struck me about it. What was your take on, first of all, his obvious interest in making sure that this remains very present in the conversation, the political conversation, particularly given the political climate we live in today?
Well, Maryelen, thanks. It's certainly incredibly relevant, what we just heard in this history, in terms of what we face today with regard to the nuclear situation that still exists, the nuclear weaponry that this country still has, and that is also has been obtained by countries around the world. So to get back to the beginning, what's perhaps most relevant, and you mentioned this, is that there is such a thing in this country, and probably in most countries, as a propaganda machine that cranks out excuses, explanations, justifications for all kinds of things that it is important for the powers that be to feel that the American public believes. It's a very, very powerful mechanism. I wish there were courses in high schools and colleges called sort of rethinking the propaganda, something like that, or how
Right.
to read it. There are courses about how to interpret advertisements and see through the ads that we get, the Madison Avenue stuff. We need to see through the propaganda and understand the history of it and how it works. The number of radio and TV stations, for example, and newspapers, then and now controlled by the CIA, is unbelievable.
Right.
So no wonder if you talk to most Americans today, and especially veterans, understandably, if you say, well, we didn't really have to drop the bomb, you will get a really, really strong negative response, because everyone believes that's saved thousands of American lives. So to me, this is something we really have to think about if we're ever really going to have a democratic society where the people are in charge and not the people in government itself who keep tremendous secrets from all of us. We have to get to the bottom of this propaganda machine.
Right, and you said so much about the work of Gar and how sort of he came into this discussion, particularly into the discussion with Franklin County continuing the political revolution.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important. We agree that it's really important to keep, not only to keep this discussion going, but to also revisit what happened in the past.
That's right. That's right. This should be a trigger, an incentive to go back in the past and look at things that we're facing still today that are buried in the secrecy and the multiple classifications of documents that not only we're not allowed to see as the public, Congress isn't allowed to see in most cases, and certainly the media is not allowed to see. So we're still surrounded by that shroud of secrecy, which I think totally undermines the whole notion of an open democracy.
Right, and the media as well, because we're talking about the media and we're talking about how, as Bob Woodward said in his recent book, Fear, I mean, this is all about that was all about suppressing fear so that the propaganda could be pushed, right? And it also, today we're talking about, as Bob Woodward said, the assault or the war on truth. And so all of it's relevant, even though it was 1940s, in 2018, it's even more important because the danger is not only still looming, but it may be worse.
I think truth seekers are, by definition, radicals.
Right. Absolutely.
And they are threats to the status quo. And again, I would say not just in this country, but in other countries. It's so ironic to me. We used to talk about Soviet propaganda, and it was indeed very powerful.
Yeah.
It's the same thing going on here, but in a way, but it's clothed more gently, and we're less liable to see it or believe it.
I think because we have so much control over, with the internet, with even television, we have so much control, more control over what we see, and it's important. So thank you very much for talking to us about this. And this is something we have to keep talking about. I agree.
Absolutely. The nuclear threat is huge.
Exactly. Exactly. This has been Democracy Here. Thank you very much for watching.
My sisters, which side are you on? Which side are you on? My sisters, which side are you on? My father was a carpenter, now he's with the air and sun. But he'll be with his fellow workers till the battle's won. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? They say in Milwaukee, cleansed by Great Lake water, you'll either be a Union man or a thug for Skywalker. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on?